The wind carried a storm of whispers across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek as Willa Kirkland stood on the auction block, her wrists bound and her pride in tatters. The year was 1875, and the West had claimed everything from her family, her home, her dignity, leaving nothing but a 19-year-old woman with fierce green eyes that refused to shed tears even as the auctioneer called for bids on her domestic services. $200 for the girl. "Do I hear $250? The red-faced auctioneer bellowed, gesturing toward Willa as if she were nothing more than livestock. "Strong back, good teeth make a fine house servant." Willa's gaze fixed on the distant mountains beyond the town, refusing to acknowledge the faces of men evaluating her worth in coins. 6 weeks ago, she'd been traveling west with her ailing father, seeking the healing mountain air of Colorado. Then came the fever that took him, the thieves who took their wagon and money, and finally the town marshal who claimed she owed a debt for her father's burial she couldn't possibly pay. "300, called a gruff voice from the back of the crowd. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "300 from Mr. Parker. Do I hear 350? Willa finally allowed herself to look at the bidders. Most were townspeople she recognized, the hotel owner seeking cheap labor, the saloon keeper with his calculating eyes, and several ranchers' wives in need of household help. But the man who'd bid 300 stood apart, tall and dust-covered at the edge of the gathering. 350, countered the hotel owner. 400, came the immediate response from the stranger. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The price was steep for a servant, especially in these hard times. Willa studied the man more carefully now. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see he was younger than most of the other bidders, perhaps 30, with broad shoulders, and the unmistakable bearing of a man accustomed to the saddle. 400 going once, twice. The auctioneer paused dramatically, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "Sold to Mr. Miles Irwin of Willow Creek Ranch." The crowd dispersed quickly, the entertainment concluded. Willa was escorted down from the platform by the sheriff's deputy, who handed her documentation to her new owner with all the ceremony of a cattle sale. Up close, Miles Irwin was even more imposing. His face was tanned and weathered from years under the sun, with lines at the corners of blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything with cool efficiency. A thin scar traced his jawline, disappearing into several days' worth of stubble. "Miss Kirkland." He tipped his hat slightly, his voice low and controlled. "I'm Miles Irwin." "I heard," Willa replied, keeping her voice steady despite the fear churning inside her. "You've purchased yourself a servant, Mr. Irwin." Something flickered in his expression, perhaps surprise at her direct address. "I've purchased your debt contract, yes." He glanced at the papers, then folded them and tucked them inside his coat. "My ranch is a half-day's ride from here. Can you ride?" "Yes," he nodded once, seemingly satisfied. "Good, we'll leave within the hour." As he turned to speak with the deputy about finalizing the transaction, Willa fought the urge to run. Where would she go? The wilderness surrounding Redemption Creek had already claimed the lives of hardier souls than herself. At least servitude offered shelter and food until she could formulate a better plan. Miles returned, untying her wrists with efficient movements. "I have some business to conclude. Meet me at the general store in 30 minutes. You'll need proper clothing and supplies." Before Willa could respond, he pressed several coins into her palm. "For anything immediate you might need, don't try to run. This town has nowhere to hide, and the wilderness has no mercy." With that warning delivered, he strode away, leaving Willa standing alone in the dusty street with money in her hand and confusion in her mind. No master she'd ever heard of immediately handed money to their newly acquired servant. True to his word, Miles was waiting at the general store when Willa arrived. He'd already purchased supplies, practical items including a heavy coat, sturdy boots, gloves, and other necessities for ranch life. The proprietor's wife helped Willa select proper clothing while Miles settled the bill without comment on the cost. As they prepared to leave town, Willa noticed the sidelong glances and whispers from the townspeople. Most looked at her with pity or disdain, but their gazes at Miles held something like respect tinged with wariness. Miles led her to where two horses waited, a large chestnut stallion and a smaller, gentle-looking mare. "This is Penny," he said, indicating the mare. "She's sure-footed and calm." Willa approached the horse cautiously, letting the animal sniff her hand before gently stroking its neck. "She's beautiful. She'll serve you well." Miles secured their purchases to the saddles with practiced ease. "The ride isn't difficult, but it's long. We should make it before sundown if we leave now." They rode in silence for the first hour, leaving Redemption Creek behind as they followed a well-worn trail through rolling hills. Willa's thoughts churned with questions about what awaited her. What kind of man bought a servant for $400? What kind of work would be expected of her? The rumors about young women sold into domestic service often had dark undertones. "Mr. Irwin," she finally said, breaking the silence, "what exactly will my duties be at your ranch?" Miles glanced over at her, his expression unreadable. "I have a house that needs tending, cooking, cleaning, the usual household tasks, and that's worth $400. His mouth twitched slightly. "Good help is hard to find in these parts. There must be women in town who would work for far less. None willing to live at the ranch. It's isolated." He adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun. "Most prefer town life." Another mile passed in silence before Willa gathered her courage again. "How many others work for you?" "There's Hector and Tomas who handle the cattle with me, old Jim who manages the horses. They have quarters by the barn." He paused. "You'll be the only one in the main house." Willa's stomach tightened. "I see." Miles reined his horse to a stop, turning in his saddle to face her directly. His expression was stern but not threatening. "Miss Kirkland, I want to be clear about something. I bought your contract to spare you from worse fates. There were men in that crowd with intentions far less honorable than mine. At my ranch, you'll have your own room with a lock on the door. You'll be treated with respect. I expect hard work and honesty, nothing more." Willa studied his face, searching for deception but finding none. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Something dark passed behind his eyes. "Let's just say I've seen what happens to women with no protection in this territory." He clicked his tongue, urging his horse forward again. "That's enough talk. We still have ground to cover." The landscape changed as they rode, transitioning from open prairie to more varied terrain with stands of aspen and pine. Late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they crested a hill, and Willa caught her first glimpse of Willow Creek Ranch spread out in the valley below. It was larger than she'd expected, a substantial two-story house built of timber and stone, surrounded by several outbuildings, corrals, and fenced pastures. A creek bordered by willows cut through the property, explaining its name. Cattle dotted the distant fields, and closer to the buildings, several horses grazed in a paddock. "That's it." Willa couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Miles nodded. "Home for the past 5 years." As they approached, Willa noticed details that spoke of prosperity but also neglect. The house itself was well built but needed paint. The garden beside it was overgrown, and the porch held stacked crates and tools rather than any comfortable furnishings. A broad-shouldered man with graying hair emerged from the barn as they rode in, raising a hand in greeting. "Jim," Miles called out as they dismounted, "this is Miss Kirkland. She'll be managing the house." Jim gave Willa a respectful nod. "Madam, good to have you here." His weathered face broke into a smile. "Maybe now we'll get something besides Miles's trail beans for supper." Miles handed Jim the reins to both horses. "Get Penny settled in, will you? I'll show Miss Kirkland around." The interior of the house confirmed Willa's first impressions. It was solidly built and contained good furniture, but everything was dusty or disorganized. The kitchen had quality cookware hanging on hooks, but the stove needed cleaning and dirty dishes were stacked beside a dry sink. "As you can see," Miles said, gesturing around, "there's plenty to be done." Willa ran a finger along a dusty shelf. "When was the last time someone cared for this house properly?" "My mother died 2 years ago. Since then, it's been neglected." There was something guarded in his tone. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right. There's a washroom at the end of the hall. Get yourself settled and I'll bring up your things." Willa found her room to be surprisingly large and comfortable, with a proper bed, dresser, washstand, and even a small bookshelf. The window overlooked the creek and mountains beyond. As promised, the door had a sturdy lock. Miles appeared moments later with her meager belongings and the new purchases. Supper is usually at 6. Nothing fancy tonight, just some salt pork and beans. Tomorrow you can take stock of the pantry and make a list of what you need. After he left, Willa sat on the edge of the bed, trying to make sense of her situation. Everything about Miles Irwin confused her. He'd spent a small fortune to buy her contract, yet he was treating her with a respect she hadn't expected. The house needed a housekeeper, certainly, but was that truly all he wanted? She unpacked her few possessions, changed into one of the new dresses, and washed the dust of travel from her face and hands. Looking at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. A week ago, she'd been a grieving daughter with no future. Now she was. What exactly? Dinner that evening was a quiet affair with just Miles and Willa at the large kitchen table. The food was simple but filling. Miles ate quickly, like a man accustomed to treating meals as necessary fuel rather than something to be enjoyed. The other men eat in the bunkhouse, he explained between bites. Hector and Tomas are bringing cattle down from the north pasture. They'll be back in a few days. How many cattle do you run? About 800 head plus 24 horses. It's a modest operation compared to some, but it turns a profit. He pushed his empty plate aside. I'll be out at dawn tomorrow. There's bread and coffee for breakfast. I usually take lunch with me, Willa nodded. I'll have dinner ready when you return. Miles studied her for a moment. This is a big change for you, I understand that. If you have questions or concerns, I'd rather you speak them plainly. Willa's hands tightened in her lap. Why did you really buy my contract, Mr. Irwin? $400 is a lot of money for household help. His expression remained neutral. I told you my reasons. You said you wanted to spare me from worse fates. That's charity, not business. Perhaps. He stood, taking his plate to the wash basin. Or perhaps I'm just tired of living in filth and eating my own terrible cooking. He paused at the kitchen door. Get some rest, Miss Kirkland. Tomorrow will be a long day. Alone in the kitchen, Willa began washing the dishes, her mind turning over everything she'd observed. Miles Irwin was a puzzle gruff but not unkind, prosperous but living almost ascetically. He'd given her no reason to fear him, yet something about him remained guarded, as if he were keeping parts of himself locked away. That night, despite her exhaustion, sleep came slowly. The strange new sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the occasional whinny of horses, the unfamiliar creaks of the house kept her alert. For the first time since her father's death, however, she felt something like security. She had a roof over her head, food in her stomach, and a door she could lock. It wasn't freedom, but it was a start. Morning came early at Willow Creek Ranch. By the time Willa made her way downstairs, Miles had already left, but Jim was waiting in the kitchen with a friendly smile and a pot of coffee. Morning, Miss Kirkland. Boss asked me to show you around, make sure you know where everything is. Jim proved to be a talkative guide, explaining the layout of the ranch and its daily rhythms as they walked the property. The tour revealed a well-planned operation. The barn and stables were clean and efficient, the smithy well-equipped, the smokehouse and storage sheds solidly built. Miles built most of this himself, Jim explained as they walked. Came out here with just his pa and brother, barely more than a boy himself. 15 years later, he's got one of the finest small spreads in the territory. His father and brother, are they still here? Willa asked. Jim's expression clouded. His pa passed on 7 years back, pneumonia, his brother David. He hesitated. There was trouble. David left about 5 years ago. Miles doesn't speak of him. And his mother, Miles mentioned she died 2 years ago. Fine woman, Elizabeth Irwin. Kept this place feeling like a home. Jim looked toward the untended garden. Miles took it hard when she passed. That's when the house started to fall to neglect. Back in the kitchen, Jim showed Willa the pantry and root cellar, both reasonably well stocked with staples. Miles gets supplies from town every few weeks. If there's anything special you need, just let him know. After Jim left, Willa spent the morning taking inventory and planning her attack on the housework. The kitchen came first, scrubbing until surfaces gleamed, organizing scattered utensils, and taking stock of cooking implements. By midday, she had bread rising and a stew simmering, filled with vegetables from the root cellar and salted beef. The afternoon was dedicated to the main living areas. Willa opened windows to let fresh air circulate, beat dust from rugs, and polished wood surfaces that hadn't seen care in months. It was exhausting work, but there was satisfaction in seeing immediate results. In a cabinet in the dining room, she discovered a set of fine china and crystal glassware, carefully wrapped and apparently unused for years. In another drawer, silver flatware tarnished with age. These were the possessions of a family with some means at odds with the Spartan way Miles currently lived. By late afternoon, Willa had made significant progress on the ground floor. Sweaty and dusty, she decided to take a brief break outside. The garden called to her, once well-planned but now overgrown. Kneeling in the dirt, she began pulling weeds from around what appeared to be struggling herbs and vegetables. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice Miles's approach until his shadow fell across her. "You don't need to tackle everything in one day," he said, removing his gloves. Willa looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "I wanted to make a start on it. The garden could still be saved with some attention." Miles surveyed the partially cleared beds. "My mother loved this garden. Said a ranch needed growing things to balance all the stock we raised for slaughter." Something like nostalgia crossed his features before he masked it. "The house looks better already." "I've only made a start. There's still much to do," he nodded. "Something smells good inside. Beef stew. It should be ready soon." That evening's dinner was a marked improvement over the previous night's fare. Miles ate with genuine appetite, accepting a second serving without hesitation. "This is good," he said simply. "Been a while since I've had a proper meal. Thank you." Willa hesitated, then added, "Jim showed me around today. He speaks highly of what you've built here." "Jim's been with us since the beginning. Loyal man." Miles broke off a piece of bread. "How are you finding your accommodations? More than adequate." Willa studied him across the table, gathering her courage. "Mr. Irwin, I'd like to understand my situation better. You purchased my debt contract. How long am I obligated to work to repay it?" Miles set down his fork. "The standard term for such contracts is 1 year. After that, the debt is considered paid. And during that year, what are the terms? Do I receive any wages? Am I permitted to leave the property? You'll receive room and board plus $2 a week for personal expenses. You're not a prisoner, Miss Kirkland. You can go into town with me when I make supply runs. After your year is up, you're free to go or stay on as a paid housekeeper." He paused. "Or whatever else you might choose." Willow wasn't sure what to make of that last comment. "That seems fair." "I try to be." He pushed back from the table. "I have accounts to review." The stew was excellent. Days fell into a pattern at Willow Creek Ranch. Willa rose early to prepare breakfast and pack a lunch for Miles, then devoted her days to transforming the neglected house. Miles worked from dawn until dusk with the cattle and horses, sometimes riding out to check fence lines or water sources. They would meet for dinner, their conversations gradually becoming less strained as they grew accustomed to each other's company. Hector and Tomas, the Mexican vaqueros who worked the cattle, returned from the north pasture after 3 days. They were cousins, Hector older and serious, Tomas younger and quick to smile, both skilled horsemen who clearly respected Miles. They took their meals at the bunkhouse with Jim, but occasionally joined Miles and Willa for Sunday dinner. After 2 weeks, the house had undergone a remarkable transformation. Floors gleamed, windows sparkled, and furniture shone with polish. Willa had discovered stored linens, curtains, and rugs that now brightened the rooms. The kitchen garden was well on its way to recovery, with the surviving herbs flourishing and new vegetable seeds sprouting in neat rows. One evening, Miles returned earlier than usual. Willa was in the kitchen, her hair escaping its pins as she kneaded bread dough. "I'm riding into town tomorrow for supplies," he announced, washing his hands at the sink. "I thought you might want to come along." Willa looked up in surprise. "Yes, I would." "There are several things we need for the house. Make a list. We'll leave at first light." The trip to town the next day was Willa's first excursion from the ranch since her arrival. As they rode, she found herself studying Miles more carefully. In the past weeks, She'd come to appreciate his quiet competence and fair-mindedness. He worked harder than any man she'd ever known, expected the same from his men, but never asked more than what was reasonable. Yet there remained an aloofness about him, a careful distance he maintained. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher, something between curiosity and caution. Other times, particularly when she asked about his family, his face would close like a shuttered window. Redemption Creek looked different to Willa now, less threatening, more simply a frontier town with its mix of saloons, mercantiles, and struggling businesses. Still, she stayed close to Miles as they made their rounds, uncomfortably aware of curious glances from townspeople. At the general store, Miles handed her a portion of money. "Get whatever you need for the house. I'll see to the feed and hardware supplies." The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Jenkins, approached Willa with an assessing gaze. "You're the girl Miles Irwin bought at auction, aren't you? How are you faring out at that ranch?" Willa straightened her shoulders. "Very well, thank you. Mr. Irwin is a fair employer." "Employer, is it?" Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. Some thought he had other intentions, buying a young woman like that. "Mr. Irwin has been nothing but respectful," Willa replied firmly. Mrs. Jenkins lowered her voice. "That's good to hear. Miles Irwin is respected around here, but there's sadness in that man after what happened with his brother and that girl from town." She stopped herself. "Well, it's not my place to gossip. What can I help you find today?" Willa was burning with curiosity about what the woman had almost revealed, but pride kept her from asking. Instead, she focused on selecting household necessities, adding fabric for new kitchen curtains and some personal items to her basket. Later, as they loaded their purchases onto the packhorses, Willa noticed Miles exchanging tense words with a well-dressed man outside the bank. Though she couldn't hear their conversation, Miles's rigid posture and the other man's dismissive gesture suggested conflict. "Who was that?" she asked as Miles mounted his horse. "Harold Blackwell owns the bank." Miles's tone discouraged further questions. "We should start back." "Looks like rain coming." They rode in silence for several miles. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Willa pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "We won't outrun this storm," Miles finally said, scanning the darkening sky. "There's a line shack about a mile ahead. We can wait it out there." The line shack proved to be a small one-room cabin with a stone fireplace, used by cowboys working distant parts of the range. Miles quickly unsaddled the horses and sheltered them beneath a lean-to attached to the side of the cabin while Willa gathered kindling for a fire. They barely made it inside before the skies opened. Rain hammered the roof as Miles built a fire in the small hearth. The cabin was simple but serviceable: a rough table and chairs, a narrow bunk against one wall, and shelves holding basic provisions. "We might be here a while," Miles said, hanging his wet coat on a peg by the door. "That's a proper cloudburst out there." Willa stood awkwardly in the small space, suddenly very aware of their isolation. Miles seemed to sense her discomfort. "I'll step outside to check on the horses once the rain lets up a bit. You can have the bunk if we need to stay the night." He busied himself arranging their saddlebags, keeping a respectful distance. The storm showed no signs of abating as afternoon turned to evening. Miles found coffee and beans in the cabin's stores, preparing a simple meal over the fire. They ate in companionable silence, listening to the rain and occasional thunder. "Mrs. Jenkins mentioned your brother today," Willa said finally, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "She said something about trouble with a girl from town." Miles's expression hardened. "Mrs. Jenkins talks too much. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." He stared into the fire for a long moment. "No, I suppose you have a right to know something of the man whose house you're living in." He set his plate aside. "My brother David was younger than me by 2 years. More charming, more reckless. 5 years ago, he got a local girl in trouble, the daughter of a prominent family. I wanted him to do right by her, marry her. He refused." Miles's voice grew distant. "Words were exchanged, then blows. He left that night and I haven't seen him since. The girl's father, Blackwell, has never forgiven our family. The girl died in childbirth. The baby, too." I'm sorry, Willa said softly. That's a heavy burden to carry. My mother never recovered from losing him, started failing not long after. Miles's jaw tightened. David was always her favorite. The raw pain in his voice touched something in Willa. Without thinking, she reached across and placed her hand over his. It wasn't your fault. Miles looked at their joined hands, then at her face, surprise evident in his eyes. For a moment, something unguarded and vulnerable showed in his expression. Then he gently withdrew his hand and stood, the reins letting up. I should check on the horses. He was gone several minutes, leaving Willa to wonder if she'd overstepped. When he returned, his shirt was damp and his expression composed once more. The trail will be mud by morning, but passable. We can head back at first light. He glanced at the bunk. You should get some rest. What about you? I'll manage with my bedroll by the fire. Willa hesitated. Miles. Thank you for telling me about your brother. I know it wasn't easy. Something shifted in his eyes at her use of his first name. Get some sleep, Willa. It's been a long day. That night, lying on the narrow bunk while Miles slept near the fire, Willa found herself thinking about the complexities of the man who had purchased her contract. Behind his reserved exterior was a person who had experienced profound loss and carried deep regrets. For the first time, she wondered what it might be like to break through those carefully maintained barriers. The thought both thrilled and frightened her. They returned to the ranch the following day, the journey made slower by muddy trails. Life resumed its regular pattern, but something had changed between them, a subtle shift in awareness, small moments of connection. Miles began lingering after dinner, sometimes helping Willa with dishes or simply sitting at the kitchen table while she baked, discussing the day's work or plans for the ranch. Willa found herself looking forward to these quiet evenings, gradually learning more about Miles's life and sharing carefully selected details of her own. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, her father's work as a clockmaker, and their decision to seek a new start in the West after her mother's death. He thought the mountain air would help his lungs, she explained one evening as she kneaded dough for the next day's bread. He'd been unwell for years, but he hid how serious it was until we were already on the trail. You must miss him, Miles said quietly. Every day. Willa's hands stilled in the dough, but I'm grateful for the time we had. Many don't get proper goodbyes. Miles nodded, understanding in his eyes. I never got to say goodbye to my father. He took ill while I was away delivering cattle. By the time I returned, he was gone. And your mother, were you with her? Yes, his voice softened. She made me promise to keep the ranch to make it thrive, said it was our family's legacy. He gave a humorless laugh. Not much of a legacy with just me left to carry the name. You've built something remarkable here, Willa said, resuming her kneading. Your parents would be proud. Miles watched her hands work the dough, a thoughtful expression on his face. You've made a difference too. The house hasn't felt like this since my mother was alive. Their eyes met across the table and something warm and unspoken passed between them. Miles cleared his throat and stood. I should check on that new foal before turning in. Good night, Willa. Good night, Miles. As spring turned to summer, the ranch grew busier. Miles and his men prepared for the summer cattle drive to the railhead, a journey that would take them away for nearly 3 weeks. Willa found herself strangely apprehensive about their departure, having grown accustomed to Miles's steady presence. The evening before they were to leave, Willa prepared a special dinner: roast beef, potatoes from her now thriving garden, and an apple pie that had become Miles's favorite. They ate mostly in silence, the upcoming separation hanging between them like an unspoken question. Jim will stay behind to look after the horses and the place, Miles finally said as they finished their pie. If you need anything, he'll help. We'll manage fine, Willa assured him. Just come back safely. Miles studied her face for a moment. I've been thinking about your contract. Willa's heart sank. For weeks, she'd almost forgotten the circumstances that had brought her to Willow Creek Ranch. What about it? Miles reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the folded document. You've more than earned your keep these past months. The house is transformed. We eat better than we ever have. He placed the contract on the table between them. I'm tearing it up. You're free to stay or go as you choose. Willa stared at the paper, emotions tumbling through her. I don't understand. It's simple. I'm releasing you from any obligation. If you want to leave, you can. If you choose to stay, I'll pay you a proper wage as my housekeeper." Miles's expression was carefully neutral. "The choice is yours." "Why now?" "Because I might not come back from this drive." He held up a hand as she started to protest. "It's always a possibility in this work. If something happens to me, I don't want you bound to this place with no say in your future." Willa's throat tightened. "Nothing's going to happen to you, nevertheless." Miles pushed the contract toward her. "It's yours to do with as you will." Willa picked up the document, the physical representation of her servitude, "and if I tear it up, what then?" "Then you stay or go by your own choice, not because of a debt." She held his gaze as she deliberately tore the contract in half, then in quarters. "I'll be here when you return, Miles Irwin." Something flickered in his eyes, relief perhaps, or something deeper. "Good, that's good." He stood, suddenly awkward. "I should finish packing. We leave at first light." The 3 weeks of Miles's absence stretched endlessly for Willa. She kept herself busy with household projects, expanded the garden, and even began exploring his mother's neglected sewing room, discovering fabric and patterns for clothes she might make. Jim provided company at meals, sharing stories of earlier days on the ranch and of Miles as a younger man. "He wasn't always so serious," Jim told her one evening as they sat on the porch. "Before all the trouble with David, Miles used to laugh more, had plans for expanding the ranch, maybe building a bigger house someday." What changed? Besides losing his brother, Jim considered for a moment. "I think Miles decided he wasn't meant for happiness, took on all the responsibility, all the blame, figured it was his lot to just work and endure." The older man gave Willa a sideways glance. "Until recently, he's different since you came. Different how? Got purpose again." "Not just working to work," Jim smiled. "I see how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." Willa felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Jim, I'm just the housekeeper." "If you say so, miss." Jim's knowing smile suggested he thought otherwise. On the 18th day after their departure, Willa was in the garden harvesting vegetables when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw riders coming down the trail, Miles in the lead, followed by Hector and Tomas. Relief flooded through her, so powerful it made her knees weak. She stood, brushing dirt from her hands as Miles dismounted in the yard. He looked tired and trail-worn, his face sunburned and stubbled with a beard, but his eyes brightened when they found her. "You're back early," she called, trying to keep her voice casual as she walked toward him. "Good weather and no trouble with the herd." He handed his reins to Tomas. "How have things been here?" "Quiet, productive." Willa smiled. "Are you hungry? I can have a meal ready soon." "A hot meal would be welcome. Let me clean up first." He hesitated, then added, "It's good to see you, Willa." "It's good to see you too." Later, after Miles had bathed and changed into clean clothes, they sat at the kitchen table as Willa served a hastily prepared but hearty meal. Miles ate with appreciation, the tension gradually leaving his shoulders as he relaxed into the familiar comfort of home. "The drive went well," he reported between bites. "Got a good price for the cattle, better than expected." "That's wonderful news. Means we can make some improvements around here, fix the roof before winter, maybe add a proper porch at the back of the house." He glanced at her. "If you have any ideas for the house, now would be the time." "Are you asking for my input on your home, Mr. Irwin?" Willa asked, a teasing note in her voice. Miles's expression softened. "It's become your home too, hasn't it?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Willa carefully set down her fork. "Yes, I suppose it has." Something in Miles's face changed, a lowering of guards, a glimpse of vulnerability. "While I was away, I had time to think, about the ranch, about the future." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "About what I want that future to look like." Willa's heart quickened. "And what did you decide?" "That I've been living half a life since my family fell apart." Miles's blue eyes held her steadily. "That maybe it's time to build something new instead of just maintaining what's left." Before Willa could respond, there was a commotion outside, the sound of an approaching wagon and unfamiliar voices. Miles frowned, rising from his chair. "We're not expecting anyone." They stepped onto the front porch to see a wagon pulling into the yard. A man and woman sat on the bench seat with a young child between them. As they drew closer, Miles went rigid beside Willa. "David," he breathed. The man on the wagon was unmistakably Miles's brother, similar in height and build, but with lighter hair and a more open countenance. He reined in the horses and set the brake, his expression a mixture of apprehension and determination. "Hello, Miles," he called. "It's been a while." For a long moment, Miles didn't move. Then, slowly, he descended the porch steps. "5 years isn't just a while, David." David helped the woman down from the wagon, then lifted the child, a boy of about 4, and set him on the ground. "I know, I should have come back sooner, or written at least." He glanced at the woman beside him. "This is my wife, Sarah, and our son, Thomas." Miles's gaze moved to the child, confusion evident on his face. "Your son?" "Yes." David's hand rested protectively on the boy's shoulder. "We've been living in California, farming, but it was time to come home." "If you'll have us." Willow watched the emotions warring on Miles's face: shock, confusion, a flash of the old anger, and beneath it all, a longing for reconciliation. She stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Why don't we all go inside?" she suggested. "I'll make some coffee and you can talk." The next few hours unfolded like a carefully orchestrated drama as years of misunderstandings and hurt were cautiously navigated. David explained that he had indeed fled Redemption Creek after their fight, ashamed and angry. He'd met Sarah in Denver, where he'd taken work as a carpenter. "She made me realize I needed to face my responsibilities," David explained as they sat around the kitchen table. "We married and returned to Redemption Creek, only to learn that Catherine Blackwell's daughter had married someone else. Her father had forced the match to save the family's reputation. But the child died," Miles said, confusion evident in his voice. "Blackwell told everyone a lie," Sarah interjected softly, "to save face. Catherine's husband adopted the baby she was carrying, David's son." She looked fondly at the sleeping child on her lap. "They raised him as their own until Catherine died of fever 2 years ago. Her husband followed last winter. Thomas had no one," David continued. "We learned of it by chance through a letter from Catherine's cousin. We came back to claim him, only to find Blackwell determined to keep us away from the boy. It took months of legal battles before a judge granted us custody." Miles sat back, visibly processing this revelation. "So Blackwell lied, all this time," I thought. He shook his head. "He looks at me with such hatred whenever I'm in town." "Because we won," David said simply. "We took his grandson, whom he'd planned to raise as his heir, and because I'm an Irwin, the family he's blamed for his daughter's unhappiness." The conversation continued long into the night. David expressed deep regret for his hasty departure and the pain it had caused their mother. Miles gradually softened, especially as he watched his nephew sleeping peacefully, the image of David at that age. Willa provided food and coffee, observing the brothers' tentative steps toward reconciliation. At one point, Sarah joined her by the stove. "You must be Willa," she said quietly. "Jim mentioned you when we first arrived. He says you've brought life back to this house." Willa smiled. "I've only tried to make it a home." Sarah glanced toward the table where the brothers now sat closer together, examining a map of the ranch. "Miles seems different from how David described him, less harsh. He carries a lot of responsibility and grief." Willa's gaze lingered on Miles. "But there's much more to him than that." Later, after David's family had been settled in the spare bedroom, Willa found Miles sitting alone on the porch steps, staring at the star-filled sky. "Are you all right?" she asked, sitting beside him. "I don't know." He ran a hand through his hair. 5 years of believing one thing only to learn it was built on lies. But your brother is back. You have a nephew. That's something to celebrate, isn't it? Miles nodded slowly. Yes, it is. He turned to look at her, his expression softening in the moonlight. Thank you for today. For helping make this reunion easier. I didn't do much. You did. You always do. His voice grew quiet. Having you here, making this place a home again. It's changed everything, Willa. She felt a flutter in her chest at the intensity in his eyes. I'm glad I could help. It's more than help. Miles's hand found hers in the darkness. Before you came, I was just existing, working the ranch, going through the motions. You've reminded me there's more to life than just surviving it. Willa's breath caught. Miles, I know your contract is torn up. You're free to make your own choices now. His fingers tightened slightly around hers. "But I hope you'll choose to stay, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife." The words hung in the night air, both terrifying and exhilarating. Willa looked into Miles's face, seeing past the guarded exterior to the man beneath, honorable, caring, wounded but healing. "Are you certain?" she whispered. "You once bought me to be your servant, and now I'm asking you to be my partner, my equal." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I love you, Willa Kirkland. I think I have since the moment you stood on that auction block, refusing to let them break your spirit." Tears welled in Willa's eyes. "I love you too. I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself." Miles's free hand came up to cup her cheek. "No more fear. No more holding back. Whatever comes, we face it together." As his lips met hers beneath the vast Colorado sky, Willa knew she'd found something she'd never expected in this wild territory, not just shelter or security, but a true home. A place to belong, a love built on respect and understanding. The next morning, Miles and Willa shared their news with David and Sarah over breakfast. The announcement was met with genuine joy, David clapping his brother on the shoulder with a wide smile. "About time you found happiness, big brother," he said warmly. "Mother would have loved Willa." "She would have," Miles agreed, his hand finding Willa's under the table. "And she would have been overjoyed to know you've returned, with her grandson, no less." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Jim acted as witness, along with David and Sarah. Hector and Tomas prepared a feast, and even a few trusted neighbors were invited to share in the celebration. As summer turned to fall, Willow Creek Ranch underwent a transformation. With David's help, Miles built the back porch Willa had wanted, creating a peaceful spot overlooking the creek where they could sit in the evenings. The brothers worked side by side to expand the corrals and repair long-neglected fencing, their relationship strengthening through shared labor. Sarah and Willa became fast friends, working together to prepare for the coming winter. Young Thomas thrived in the ranch environment, following his uncle Miles everywhere and learning about horses from Jim. One crisp October evening, as Willa and Miles sat on their new porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains, Miles wrapped an arm around his wife's shoulders. "I've been thinking," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We should expand the house, add another bedroom or two." Willa leaned into his embrace. "For guests, eventually." Miles's hand moved to rest gently on her still flat stomach, "But first for our own family." Willa turned to him in surprise. "How did you know I was going to tell you tonight?" Miles's face broke into a rare, unreserved smile. "You've been glowing for days, and you haven't touched coffee in a week." His expression grew tender. "Are you happy about it?" "Happier than I ever thought possible." Willa covered his hand with hers. "A year ago, I stood on an auction block with nothing. Now I have everything: a home, a family, a future. And you were never nothing, Willa. You were always extraordinary." Miles drew her closer. "I may have bought a servant, but I found a wife, a partner, and the love of my life." As darkness fell over Willow Creek Ranch, the lights of the farmhouse glowed warm against the approaching night. Inside, a family gathered, brothers reconciled, new bonds formed, and the promise of another generation to come. What had begun as a transaction had transformed into something far more precious, a love that had healed old wounds and opened the way to a future filled with hope. In the spring of 1877, Willa gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Miles's mother. 2 years later, a son joined the family, strong and healthy like his father. David and Sarah built their own cabin on the ranch property, close enough for the cousins to grow up together, but giving both families their privacy. The Irwin brothers expanded their operation, adding sheep to their cattle and horses. When Blackwell's bank failed following years of poor investments, they purchased additional land, making Willow Creek one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory. Miles, once known for his solitary nature, became respected not just as a successful rancher, but as a family man and community leader. And at the heart of it all was the woman who had arrived as a servant, but became the cornerstone of a thriving family, Willa Irwin, who had found freedom and love in the place she least expected it.